I stand before you today to detail the state of our city finances, to talk about the fiscal mountain that we must climb again in the face of a catastrophic collapse of our local and national economy. It would be easy in this moment to simply talk about dollars and cents, revenue loss, forecasts, and resulting hard choices, to merely reflect upon the resulting sacrifices that we will all have to make. All of that is true and unavoidable. But in this moment, it demands so much more. It demands more of me as a mayor, but truly all of us as residents of this great city and its neighbors whose fates are inextricably intertwined. I stand here today 5 months after COVID-19 came to our city. Over 71,000 cases and climbing, hitting every corner of our city, but disproportionately impacting Black and brown communities with sickness and death, leaving all of us afraid and angry and frustrated and irreparably changed. We are here a mere 3 months after the murder of George Floyd and the righteous civic outcry that still echoes in our streets through the chants of many who demand change. Our consciousness has been pricked, and we must challenge ourselves to listen, to learn, but also to be bold in our actions in forging real solutions, foundational change, and not just nibbling around the edges of problems that have plagued us for far too long. And I know that challenge includes me. Our young people are calling upon us in this moment to acknowledge the present-day damage originating hundreds of years after America's original sin of slavery, which spawned a cancer that metastasized into segregation, discrimination, and cut short lives and left potential unrealized because we have still failed to forge that more perfect union. We are also here together, staring into our future while trying to address the ongoing violence that rocks parts of our city and more recently looting, all of which renders too many of our residents fearful and insecure about their physical safety, and too many businesses already hard hit by COVID-19 related shutdowns, despairing anew about their path forward. We cannot talk about our fiscal health divorced from this moment in history. All of these cross-currents affect our financial future. This is a critical inflection point. It is momentous and a moment that all agree requires us to reject the status quo and step into our truths. I have said before, and I believe it now, that even in the face of this fiscal crisis, we should not and indeed cannot abandon our values. The challenges that we face require us to lean into our values of equity and inclusion, not discard them as luxurious indulgences for easier times. No, we must continue building on the foundation that we set on day one of this administration. What this time demands is that we come together as neighbors, casting aside the divisive rhetoric and rolling up our sleeves together as Chicagoans. We dare not retreat. We cannot retreat. And my friends and neighbors, we will not retreat. As a person of faith and one who believes in the healing power of hope, I know with the certainty that we will find our way to a safer, more prosperous, and more just future. To paraphrase the great poet Robert Frost, the only way forward is through. We have been through more this year than any city should have to endure in any time, let alone in 6 months, back to back to back. But we have been through tough times before, and we have always come through out of the moment stronger and more resilient than ever before. And this time will be no different, but it will require us to continue working together. We are strong, we are resilient because we are Chicago. Now let's begin by talking about where we are now. As we are all painfully aware, the impact of COVID-19 on our city has been devastating, leading to over 71,000 confirmed cases and claiming the lives of over 2,800 Chicago residents. COVID-19 is still here, and we must continue to be diligent, just as we were in the early days when this virus first hit our city. Meanwhile, this disease has forced a seismic disruption of our economy, and as a consequence, our city's finances. Latest numbers tell us that over 900,000 Chicago area residents have filed for unemployment since the start of the pandemic, pushing our region's latest unemployment rate to 12.6%. Now, that's up from February's rate of 3.6%. Meanwhile, many who have a job are receiving a fraction of their normal compensation as businesses or employers struggle. We also know that for many sectors, like hospitality, convention and tourism, and personal services, areas that have been the hardest hit by COVID-19 induced shutdowns, many of those businesses are still seeing a fraction of their typical revenues, and some businesses have sadly closed with no hope of coming back. In this, we are far from alone. Like every city and town in every corner of our nation, Chicago has seen economic activity dramatically fall and jobless rates surge to levels not seen since the Great Depression. The economic impact of COVID-19 has hit revenue streams for the city budget hardest in the areas of tourism, hospitality, and transportation. And while we are fortunate to have a diverse economy, nonetheless, the significant loss of revenues in these areas continues to be felt now and likely will be deep into 2021. To mitigate the economic impact of COVID-19, we implemented a number of initiatives to support small businesses, employees, and individuals. And these have included the $100 million Small Business Resiliency Fund, which filled gaps for people like the unbanked or immigrant-owned small businesses who could not access the federal Paycheck Protection Program, and as of Friday, saved nearly 4,000 jobs. The $5 million Micro Business Grant Program, which offered grants to micro businesses with 4 employees or less. This program was also open to all, regardless of citizenship status. The $2 million Chicago Housing Grants Fund for renters who were struggling to make ends meet and make their rent payments. And more recently, the city launched the $10 million Chicago Now Fund, which focused on assisting businesses harmed by COVID-related revenue loss, looting, and other property damage. We have also used our CARES Act funding to provide additional social services supports through programs like Chicago Connected, which is working to provide internet access to 100,000 CPS students, in addition to more housing assistance for those in need, homelessness prevention, seniors, food assistance, mental health, and workforce development, among other investments that we have made using our CARES Act funding. In addition to these city investments, generous individuals, the business community, and philanthropy have stepped up in ways big and small to shore up those in need during these most challenging of times. And we owe them our gratitude. Despite these and other ongoing efforts, our economy, and therefore our revenue streams, remain challenged. Let's talk specifics about the 2020 budget shortfall. That's our budget shortfall for this year. We told you several weeks back that our budget gap for this fiscal year 2020 was approximately $700 million. Because our economy is still in crisis, that estimate has now increased to almost $800 million. Why? As you'll recall, when we announced our projections 2 months ago, we conservatively estimated a shortfall of approximately $700 million due to the impact of COVID-19. In developing that projection, we anticipated a fairly slow recovery, especially compared to other national forecasts. However, in making our announcement, we said that whether that projection would hold depended on several factors. First, that any increase in COVID-19 cases would potentially widen our budget shortfall even further. And given the unpredictability of the pandemic, no one can say with certainty how a recovery would proceed. Due to the recent rise in COVID-19 levels, our estimated shortfall has grown to almost $800 million. The rising case levels have hampered our city's economic recovery, particularly those businesses most impacted by COVID-19, like restaurants, bars, hotels, entertainment venues of all sizes, from small independent clubs to large concerts and tours, convention and tourism, hotel, and all the other related businesses. They have all been impacted and are still hurting because COVID-19 is still here and on the rise. There is a direct cause and effect. Also affecting the recovery was looting and damage to our businesses that occurred 3 months ago and again more recently. Now, the damage that was done was not just about shattered windows and lost inventory. The criminals who broke into stores, helping themselves to somebody else's property, shattered hopes and dreams and confidence in Chicago as a place that can sustain lives and livelihoods. And unfortunately, fear begets fear. Now, we have taken definitive steps to shore up our security and hopefully confidence, and also hold those who committed these crimes accountable. And I say this as a Black woman, born of parents whose life dreams were quickly snuffed out by the brutality of racism and segregation. No one's life circumstances justify criminal conduct against another, period. Now, we must continue our diligence against COVID-19 and against violence in any form that threatens our city, particularly the gun violence that has plagued our neighborhoods for generations, leaving families shattered and our communities gripped in collective trauma. Nothing is more important. To confront the financial challenge immediately before us and close the $800 million 2020 shortfall, we have already identified $550 million of solutions. These include leveraging up to $350 million in funding from the CARES Act and at least $200 million from debt refinancing. We also expect to be able to address the remainder through a combination of continued efficiencies, spending controls, additional federal funding, and borrowing. Now, this is the reality of a budget deeply impacted by this horrible virus. Now, as you must know, COVID-19's budgetary impact is not limited to 2020, but extends into the upcoming year. As reported in our budget forecast, which we released today, our projected gap for 2021 is estimated to be $1.2 billion. Let me say that again, $1.2 billion. Make no mistake, this will be our pandemic budget. Now, I emphasize this point about our 2021 pandemic budget because there is a narrative among some that there should be no federal help from municipalities like Chicago, in some states like Illinois, because somehow our budgetary woes are as a result of years of mismanagement. In other words, our own darn fault. Simply not true. COVID-19's estimated impact on revenue loss for 2020 totals no less than $783 million, or 65% of our total estimated gap. So the vast majority of our gap for next year is because of revenue loss due to COVID-19. COVID-19 is the single largest driver of our economic challenges and our city's budgetary gap. Make no mistake, our economy will recover over the next few years. But for that to happen as quickly and stably as possible, Chicago, along with every other city and every other state in our country, must have the resources to address the impacts of COVID-19 on our pandemic budget right now, in this moment. The federal government simply must step up and support our cities and states with additional stimulus dollars critically needed by our families and businesses. We are in a crisis unlike anything experienced in our lifetimes. This should not be up for debate. I know this is a campaign season, but this is not a red versus blue state issue. This is a calamitous financial crisis, bipartisan in its impact, and we need a bipartisan solution. We cannot let the policymakers in Washington, D.C. fiddle while our country burns. That is why we fully support the efforts of our Illinois delegation, led by our Senators Dick Durbin and Tammy Duckworth, in advocating for more funding for families, businesses, and communities. But regardless of the outcomes in Washington, our 2021 budget was thankfully saved from even greater financial hit due to the numerous structural reforms we undertook in creating our 2020 budget last year. As you'll recall, in our effort to close last year's gap of over $800 million, the city implemented over $500 million in structural solutions, meaning revenue sources that were not one-time fixes, but that continue year after year. This represents the largest amount of structural revenue solutions since 2012 and represented 60% of our budget for this year. These included new revenue streams that met both policy and financial goals, and fully supporting both our police and fire pension ramps to actuarial funding for the first time in our city's history. It's because of these measures, along with others, that last year's budget rightfully won the approval of our nation's major credit rating agencies, as well as the approval of local financial watchdogs like the Civic Federation. The remainder of that gap from last year is what we continue to address today. Now, regardless of the outcomes, our goal this year in this pandemic budget is to get through this crisis and continue our initial efforts to spur a robust recovery. So how do we meet the ongoing and challenging process over the coming weeks that will demand involvement and input from our entire city? To reiterate, a critical factor will be the level of funding we receive from the federal government. Now, let me be clear. We are clear-eyed about the political obstacles, but nonetheless, we remain resolute in our advocacy for federal relief. The resources from the CARES Act have been critical in enabling us to support our ongoing response to the COVID-19 crisis, encompassing many of the programs that I listed earlier. But let me remind you that by law, the CARES Act dollars cannot be used for straight-up revenue replacement, and more federal help is desperately needed. This is precisely the time for the federal government to provide additional stimulus for Main Street and not just Wall Street. We need our fair share of revenue from Springfield as well, starting with fully funding the Local Government Distributive Fund, or LGDF. And yes, I'm painfully aware of our state's own fiscal challenges. Even so, tax dollars from Chicagoans fund Springfield, just like tax dollars from other municipalities across our state. And just like our fellow Illinoisans, we in Chicago want the same thing: fairness. And fairness in this context means getting our fair share of funding. To our partners in Springfield, we're in this together, and we've done great things together already in my short time in office. And I know that we can work together to fully fund LGDF and avoid sending us unfunded mandates. And yes, we must also continue to work together to find real solutions to the pension crisis and make sure that all of the funds are sustainable for years to come. Beyond additional funding from the federal government and our fair share of state funding, our financial team, who's here with me today, have been working on an array of other measures. Just as we did in the 2020 budget, for months now, we have been proactively working to identify efficiencies as good stewards of your tax dollars. And just as our 2020 budget, these efforts are guided by our values of growth that is strong and sustainable, and most of all, inclusive. This includes looking at existing contracts to make sure that they are needed, and if so, ensuring that we are getting the benefit of our bargain. We will be scrutinizing all dollars spent with an eye towards maximizing jobs and wealth for Chicagoans. On the expense side, we are also exploring traditional efficiencies such as vacancy closures, but also reimagining how our government operates post-COVID-19. The reality is that life will be different for the foreseeable future, impacting how services are provided and how departments are structured, and we must adjust to meet that reality. A very difficult part of reimagining government will also be looking to our workforce and making needed changes in places that are not being fully utilized during the remainder of this crisis and in our post-COVID-19 world. Some painful choices will have to be made, including likely the necessity of personnel reductions. Now, I don't take this lightly. Our city workers are the backbone of our town's middle class. So I'll do everything I can to prevent layoffs. But the reality is stark, and our options in this fiscal crisis are limited, all of which will require some hard and yes, painful choices. We have started our conversations with our partners in organized labor, which will be absolutely essential as we move forward. And to those in the labor union, let me say this. As we navigate this crisis together, you have my word. Anything that we do will involve the engagement and collaboration. No proposal is set in stone, and we welcome all ideas and your partnership. And yes, we must continue the important discussion that has already started around funding public safety, including our police department. But first, a note of caution. Some framing of this important discussion poses a binary choice: either fund the police or fund communities. That is, in my estimation, a false choice. To continue our mission of building safe and vibrant neighborhoods, we need to both fund communities and resources all of our public safety departments. Of course, we need to continue the work of reining in costs that were unchecked for years, like overtime and litigation expenses. And we put those controls into our 2020 budget, and they must be a feature of our 2021 budget and for every year thereafter. And equally important, we need to continue building on reforms mandated by the consent decree. In the long run, these reforms will help us reduce the millions that we spend every year on police misconduct settlements. And we must fund our investments in our people and neighborhoods, just like we did in 2020 budget, with historic investments in mental health, housing, homelessness prevention, violence prevention, and economic development in initiatives like Invest Southwest, just to name a few. This can't be an either-or choice. For me, the crux of this discussion around public safety funding is answering the threshold question of who is the best responder to address a community's call for help. For far too long, we have reflexively answered the police, while defunding needed social services. But the truth is that by virtue of our neglecting communities, police officers are responding to calls for help that go far beyond their training and expertise. That sets them up for failure and for community scorn. I have heard the calls of the mass movement we've seen in our streets and around the country, and I agree with them. We need to get serious about the possibility for alternatives and continue the policy shift that we started last year in treating violence like a public health crisis and responding with an array of interventions that may or may not involve police officers. Let's dig in and have that discussion, and let's be thoughtful and kind along the way. Those are some thoughts around expenses. And on the revenue side, we are continuing to explore new sources that make sense from both a policy and financial perspective. We need to make choices about revenue that aid our economy and not hinder it. We must be smart, prudent, and strategic, and make choices that spur growth and build wealth. We must avoid grabbing any revenue source without regard to the consequences. For example, we are taking a hard look at the personal property lease tax on computer leases. This is an area that we've seen historical growth, and due to the likely increase in teleworking, expect to continue post-COVID-19. That is a revenue source that is currently lower than other lease taxes. We will also find revenue in tax valuations, which have been stronger than expected, helping support a large TIF surplus. As you recall, in our 2020 budget, we declared a TIF surplus in excess of $300 million, the largest in the city's history. We will work aggressively to surplus again this year. And while we have made historic reforms to the TIP program already, our work there isn't done. And we will have more announcements in that regard over the course of the next year. Finally, while the 2021 will be our pandemic budget, we will also continue to build bridges to structural balance in the years ahead. As I said earlier, our economy will recover from this crisis, and we need to position ourselves to be ready to capitalize on that in Chicago. The faster we recover, the faster we can continue to build and walk toward the path to structural balance. And government, at all levels, will play a central role in providing the stimulus needed to speed that recovery. For that reason, last week, we posted a request for information to solicit ideas and feedback for a Chicago casino. After decades of futility, Chicago was finally granted an opportunity to bring casino gambling to the city, thanks to great collaboration with our partners in Springfield. Now, we will be bold in our ambitions for a world-class entertainment district, not simply a casino. And we will create good-paying union jobs in the construction and ongoing operation. We welcome all responses from operators in the industry to key stakeholders who have an interest in the development of a casino that are in line with our values of transparency and community engagement. The casino RFI announcement represents just the beginning of our budget process. And as we move closer to our budget address in October, we will be providing more details on the avenues that we'll be exploring to generate revenue to close our $1.2 billion gap. But let me say this. Our responsibility to our city and our taxpayers demands that we prepare for every contingency, whether it be a protracted economic recovery or a second surge in COVID cases or both. That is why it is imperative that as a city, we adhere to the public health guidelines until we have an available vaccine. As I've said before, health is what got us into this, and health is what will get us out of this. And the higher our city's case rate is, the slower our recovery will be. It's really that simple. Let me end where I started. We have been through a lot, but I will tell you the thing that has me most concerned is increasingly we seem to have lost the ability to talk to each other, and our ability to work together towards common goals is becoming increasingly limited. The discussion has moved from how can we work together to how can we score points. We are losing our ability to see each other's perspective. Too many of us ascribe the worst motives to anyone who does not agree 100% with our beliefs. We need to change the tone of our discourse, and no better place to start than the process we will engage in together over our fiscal future. And when I say we, that includes me as well. I am proud of what this administration has accomplished to take on the status quo that was failing too many Chicagoans, and to do it in a short time against a lot of odds. We have made progress, but there's still more work to do. But I need to push myself harder to work with people with whom I do not agree, and who do not agree with me. If you are focused on creating a better tomorrow for our residents, then I will be more intentional to find common ground with you. Reach out to me and I will do the same. There is more that I must do, not only as mayor, but as a person who loves this city and its people, as a neighbor, as a friend, and as a mom. I want my daughter to see her mother as a person of great strength and great character. a person who is fearless advocate for those who are locked out from access to power and resources for far too long, a person of empathy and with an open mind and a compassionate heart. While I have worked hard to model the behavior that I want our young people to emulate, I know that I must do more. And I hope that people of goodwill in the city will join me. In the face of all the darkness that we have endured, we still have tremendous courage and strength among our youth, our first responders, our healthcare workers, and our volunteers and thousands of unsung heroes who do the Lord's work every day simply because it is the only moral choice. Have things gone right every time? Of course not. People will write books about 2020, and some of the chapters will not be pretty. But through it all, the greatness of our people and this magnificent city has come shining through. Let's create and pass along that spirit every day. It is never too late for us to do more, to listen, to work together, and at least here in Chicago, strive towards that more perfect union. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and I look forward to being with you shoulder to shoulder on this journey toward our shared future. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless our beloved city of Chicago. And now I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mayor. A few questions before I pass it on to some of the questions that we've gotten in during your address.
Now, I know who you are, Leah, but do you want to introduce yourself?
Shall I introduce myself?
Yes.
Leah Hope, ABC 7, thank you. You alluded to, more than alluded to, you said specifically, all Chicagoans are going to have to sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't mention specific numbers, you didn't mention specific departments, but what are you talking about? You're talking about cuts in service, layoffs, property tax. People are obviously nervous about a lot of things in the world. Mm-hmm. Can you be more specific about the sacrifice that you're asking Chicagoans to make?
Well, keep in mind that today's announcement is about a forecast for the 2020 budget and obviously updating our fellow residents on where we are in 2021. Today is not a day for us to roll out specific solutions. This is the start of a process by which we get to specific solutions when we present our budget to City Council in October. But I've been very clear about the fact that all options have to be on the table. You mentioned several. Particularly a property tax increase as well as potentially layoffs and furloughs. I've been very clear that when it comes to those two things, property tax increase, layoffs and furloughs, those are at the end of my list of tools and options, but they have to be on the table given the size of the budget deficit that we're facing for next year, which is historic in its size. I can't recall a time in my life in Chicago that we faced a budget deficit of $1.2 billion. So I think people of goodwill understand that we've got to look at and make some hard and painful choices. We'll start where we started before, which is looking internally to build efficiencies as much as possible, but we're not going to get all the way there. We're going to have to make some tough choices. A lot will depend upon whether or not we get additional funding from the federal government. As I've said before, and I'll say it again, this COVID-19 impact on our finances and on our economy is something that has been bipartisan in its impact. I talk to mayors across the country all the time, and regardless of whether they're Republican or Democrat, they're all in the same boat. We're all facing the same challenges, and for many of them, they didn't get any any CARES Act relief. This is something that demands a solution at the federal level. Now, again, we're clear-eyed about the politics and it's campaign season, and right now they're at an impasse. But we're going to keep putting our foot on the gas to press them to step up and do the right thing, not just for Chicago, but for our nation. They've got to be statesmen in this moment, and what this moment demands is stepping up and making sure that our economy can actually recover. We won't get there in a way that I think everyone hopes and needs if we don't get further federal assistance.
Is it realistic to continue on that path that you're hoping for federal assistance when you do understand very well the realities in Washington and of this political season?
Well, we've got to operate at multiple levels, and the team that's here, and I should introduce them. This is Jennie Bennett to my far right, who's our CFO, Susie Park, who's our Budget Director, and here on the right is Reshma Soni, who is our Comptroller. We're very clear-eyed, and obviously always, and particularly when we're looking at the magnitude of the budget gap for next year, we're looking at a range of different contingencies. But we're not going to give up making the case and pressing for federal resources. But of course, we're going to have contingencies in the event that those don't materialize by the time that we need to present our budget to the City Council in October.
So talking about those contingencies, and I know you said you don't want to get into too many specifics, but back to that, the issue of asking Chicagoans to sacrifice when, as you mentioned, businesses are closed, businesses that will not come back to Chicago. Residents are leaving Chicago because of the uncertainty, because of e-learning, because of e-working, for so many reasons. So asking those who remain to make more sacrifice. People listening to this may have a hard time hearing that.
Well, I understand that. I have a hard time saying it. This is not an environment in which any of us want to be in, but we have to play the cards that we are dealt. And the conditions that you're talking about are unfortunately conditions that are manifest in every city and town across the country, not just big cities, medium-sized cities and small towns. Our economy is hurting. There's a reason why there have been comparisons to depression-like conditions, because it is so deep, it is so widespread all across the country. So the sacrifices that I know we're going to have to make as a city, as residents, as taxpayers, are the same sacrifices that mayors across the city, across the country have already been asking their residents to make. They may be in a little different budget cycle than we are, but I know from my conversations with them, and also obviously keeping a pulse on what's happening nationally, this is a conversation that's happening all across the country.
With that trend with people leaving, are you concerned that this may add to motivation for people wanting to get out of the city?
Of course you have that concern. And if we were in a different position than any place else in the country, I'd have even greater concern. But there's no place in the country that isn't suffering exactly the same kind of hard choices that we are. And so the grass is unfortunately not greener someplace else. What I know is that we need to do everything that we can to be smart about the choices that we are going to be using. And as I said in my prepared remarks, we've got to think about revenue sources that are going to be an additive, that are going to help spur our recovery and not impede it. So that's why we have to be strategic and smart and prudent about the revenue choices that we do make. We don't want to lose more businesses. We certainly don't want to lose more population. We want people to believe, because it's real, that their future lies here in the city of Chicago, and we're going to do everything we can to make that a reality.
And I know you're going to be participating in a series of town halls.
Yes.
About possibilities, and you mentioned this world-class entertainment district. You know, where do you envision something like that being? What do you hope to get out of these town hall meetings?
Well, I'm not going to talk about particular locations for a casino.
I guess when you think big picture,
Yeah.
areas of the city that might need it, where would you envision seeing something like that?
Yeah, again, I'm not going to talk about specific locations, but what I can tell you is this. We're Chicago. We are world-class. And I want to make sure that we create a world-class entertainment district that happens to contain a casino. What I envision is restaurants and other entertainment options. If you look at what's happened across the industry of gaming, particularly in the last 10 years, many of the casinos make more revenue or just as much revenue from entertainment as they do from the gaming itself. So we've spent a lot of time, and we will continue to, making sure that we really understand this industry inside and out. We've got a great team of experts who are in regular conversation with casino operators all across the world. We'll learn a lot through the RFI. We'll see if the market is ready. We'll see what the interest is, but I'm confident that when the time is right, we will be able to put together a package of revenue and other incentives to make sure that we have the kind of entertainment district that will not only be true to the legislation that we were able to get passed in Springfield, but to create a lot of jobs that are good jobs, well-paying jobs, to make sure that we bring opportunity to our city and to our residents.
This first town hall is dealing with public safety.
Say it again.
This first town hall is dealing with public safety.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the issue broadly in your address, and it comes after a weekend where we had a lot of violence. We had a very unfortunate incident in the Morgan Park, Beverly neighborhood. To reverse this trend, it seems like we're talking about it every Monday. In broad strokes, what is it that can be done in this budget? You mentioned both investing in public safety and investing in community at a time when we're sacrificing?
Well, we have to do this, and here's why. When you look at the root causes of violence and you treat it as a public health crisis, what you see consistently across the neighborhoods that are most challenged by violence is a lack of opportunity and a lack of hope. If we abandon those neighborhoods and we don't make the investments, all we're doing is paying on the back end when we should be making the investments on the front end. Neglecting neighborhoods, as has happened for far too long over many decades, has cost and consequences. It is not cost-free. So investing in these neighborhoods, investing in people, giving people hope, building a pipeline to the legitimate economy, those are all things that inure to our benefit, help us expanding our tax base, retaining population. All of those things are critically important for the future of our city. So we can't just look at a budget in isolation for 1 year. We've got to look at it from a strategic position and look at the investments that are going to bear fruit multiple years in the future. And that's what I think thinking about public safety and reimagining what that is all about and has to be about. We started that work in our 2020 budget. We will continue it in our 2021 budget.
And I do have some other questions that are on other topics for the mayor. Were there other questions on the
It's fine.
About the budget?
It's fine. Go.
All right. I got more questions. So off topic.
Sure.
So from Rachel Hinton from the Sun-Times, inquiring about your thoughts on the president's planned trip to Kenosha, while some have asked that he not go to Kenosha.
Well, I'm very concerned about it, and I don't think that this is the right time by this president to visit Kenosha. If I believe that he would come with a message of healing and unity, that would be one thing. But what we see from him over and over again, and particularly as part of his reelection bid, is to exploit tensions and division. And that's the last thing that Kenosha needs, it's the last thing that Wisconsin needs, and it's the last thing that our region and our country need. So I understand and agree with the call from the governor of Wisconsin and other local elected officials in Wisconsin asking the president not to go to Kenosha in this time. We, as I said in my remarks, we need to figure out how we can build bridges to each other. We need to get rid of the divisive rhetoric. All that is doing is deepening the despair that so many people feel. I have not seen this president in almost 4 years as somebody who understands the need to unify the country. What he seems to be focusing on is divisions and driving a wedge between different races, genders, Democrats, and so forth. So if I thought he was going to come with a message of healing, then that would be a different story. But I don't expect that. People show you who they are, and certainly over time. And I think this president has shown us who he is.
And then a couple questions regarding CPS. Of course, e-learning and education on the minds of so many,
Sure.
So many parents. Sorry, my mic was a little off to the side. So these questions are from Kelly Bauer from Block Cup Chicago. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that CPS will be fully ready to get all students up and running with remote learning next week? And then adding on to that, when you have multi-child households, are they going to be given multiple devices?
Oh, yeah. So let me take the second question first. The CPS, along with, and I count in that, building principals and other stakeholders in the school community have been working diligently to make sure that CPS students are connected. That's part of the reason why we were so excited about the announcement for Chicago Connected. It's not enough just to bring a device. If you don't have Wi-Fi and broadband connectivity, the device is useless. So we continue to work with our local partners to make sure that CPS parents understand that you can get Wi-Fi connectivity for free. And we've offered that to 100,000 different families. We continue to make sure that we work hard to reach those families and get them signed up. And that work will be ongoing through the course of the school year. We haven't met our goal, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that parents in particular and guardians understand that this resource is there and available for them and will exponentially, I think, improve the learning opportunities for CPS students. Will CPS be ready? There's always going to be some challenges at the start of a new school year, whether it's in person or whether it's virtual. I think CPS learned a tremendous amount from the experience last spring. I know that Dr. Jackson and her team have been working diligently now for months to make sure that they are ready. And I have confidence in the plan that they have put forward. But the plan is only as good as the execution, and the execution also depends not just on CPS upper management, but on every single person connected to the school environment, digging down and being serious about making sure that our children have the best possible learning environment.
And then related to that,
can you just
sorry, related to the connectivity issue, this is still from Kelly from Black Club.
Tell Kelly she gets one question.
Well, it's an interesting point.
All right.
She says that some parents in Inglewood have reached out to Black Club, unable to get the free internet service due to outstanding bills with Comcast. So is the district working with families to make sure they can have the free service despite perhaps some other outstanding issues?
Yes, and they should reach out to CPS. We can provide the number or the email address, but yes, they should reach out to CPS to work through those issues. We anticipated that those issues would exist, and we've been working diligently over the course of the summer to make sure that that's not an obstacle for making sure that school children are connected.
Let's do one that I want to share. Yeah. Any other questions in the room?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Mayor, back to the budget. Hi. You say you talked to labor about the efficiencies. When do you anticipate that you have to do those layoffs? Do you have to do it this fall if you're getting the budget passed?
Well, the conversations with organized labor have just begun, and I don't anticipate anything happening regarding layoffs or furloughs with respect to the 2020 budget. That's for looking forward to the 2021 budget, and those conversations are just started. I'm hoping that we can avoid them entirely, but I'm very clear-eyed about the challenges that we face closing a $1.2 billion budget deficit. So I don't want to speculate about what that's going to look like because those conversations are still in the early stages.
But how long can the city wait for the federal government to act? And on the other side, how is it fair to ask for the sacrifice of every Chicagoan when the crisis hasn't impacted every Chicagoan the same way?
That's an interesting point. First point, regarding the federal government, we're going to keep pushing, but we're not going to wait. We're going to have contingency plans, whether we get additional resources now or never. We have to. We're going to continue our advocacy and pushing on it, both with our federal delegation, but also as part of national mayoral associations that I'm involved in. The need is there. As I said before, it's bipartisan in its impact. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to see a break in the impasse when they come back together after Labor Day. Look, the reality is it's not one for one. It's not me for me and the heck with the rest of you. We have to all be in this together because the reality is that everything that we do, particularly in this COVID-19 reality, affects everybody else in the city. And yes, of course, the impacts of it have been uneven. They've been disproportionate in Black and brown communities. But I don't want to live in a world where we say, you all have to shoulder the burden of this and the rest of us are going to be fine. We have to be in this together as a city. That's how we do our work. That's how we plan our budgets. And we need to make sure that we are taking care of each other as neighbors. And that's the thing that I think, if there are many lessons learned from these last 6 months, but one of the most important is how total strangers have banded together to step up and be there for their neighbors. And that's the way we're going to get through this crisis. Mike, did you have a question? Okay. Can we get a clean mic for Mike? Right,
could I ask just a housekeeping question first?
Yep.
Does the $1.2 billion include the $400 to $500 million needed for the pension ramp next year?
Let me, you want to come?
So it's,
I'll let Jenny answer that question.
Yes, it does.
and so it's really just an operational shortfall then of about 700 and change.
So this is the budget gap for the corporate fund, which is our operational budget.
Okay, and what's happening at the airports? I mean,
So
a
the
90 to 95% drop in revenue there.
Sure.
Are you going to have to do a workout with the bondholders?
So the 90 to 95% drop is really in reference to the time that we were in shelter in place. We've seen the revenues pick back up since the shelter in place has been lifted. The airports have also benefited from $294 million of CARES Act funds at O'Hare, as well as $82 million of CARES Act funds at Midway. We have put together a financial plan that we believe helps to resolve the financial situation at O'Hare.
So are the bondholders expressing concerns?
I haven't heard any concerns.
Okay. And Madam Mayor, could I ask you said you're going to push yourself harder to work with people that you have disagreements with. Mm-hmm. Could I ask you about this police house? I've gotten to know the people at 102nd and State Street. The alderman there is no friend of yours. I certainly understand that. But for the residents, there have been 3 young men shot, 2 dead in the last few months on that block. Mm-hmm. And I've been there half a dozen times. There are offers dating back to last year when your staff was briefed on it. I think Susan Lee was briefed on it, for $250,000 a year going forward. Ford Motor Company's offered a special police vehicle for free. The sheriff's willing to post some people there. What's happened to that? It just seems like it seems like just the sort of community policing initiative that would be worth experimenting with.
So I'm not familiar with the specifics there, but I will obviously dig into it. But anywhere where we've got people who are of goodwill, who are offering to help, particularly in areas that are distressed, and we've seen some progress there, but still some challenges, we're more than willing to step up and look at things that make sense for the long term. Sometimes people come forward with things that are one-timer that don't really solve the problem for the long term. But if there's an opportunity there for us to do some good, we'll definitely do it.
Okay, and on the casino, is there a model anywhere? I mean, I've been to a lot of places, big cities. Cleveland, it looks like a sterile. It's in that old Higbee's department store. You know Cleveland. I mean, it's a sterile nothing. Out in the suburbs, they were going to have entertainment districts in Elgin. They were going to have them downstate. Nothing. Indiana, it hasn't happened. Is there a model anywhere besides the Vegas Strip?
Well, we've looked at a number of places around the country and around the world, and I don't think there's any examples of what my and our vision for an entertainment district are that are anywhere in Illinois or even in the Midwest. The places that we have seen across the country that I think have been most successful in maximizing the investment have a lot of different features to them, as I've described. It's not just a box that's a casino. It's not even just the restaurants, but we've seen some models in other places across the country where, for example, they've created kind of a community venue in a square. They've done interesting things with everything from farmers markets to having small concert venues, and really making it something that is a go-to attraction year-round. So those are the kind of things that we're looking at. And we're also looking overseas in places that have been successful as well. But this has got to be something that's uniquely Chicago, that really focuses on, I think, our strengths and helps lure tourists back to our city. So we're excited about the opportunities. But part of the reason that we're putting out an RFI is to help us see ideas that are generated by really leaders and experts in the industry. I have some sense of the kind of things that we want. And as I said, we've surveyed a lot of different gaming centers across the country and across the world and looked at what's worked, what hasn't worked, learned lessons from municipal leaders who've had this opportunity. This has taken us 30 years to get to, and we want to make sure that we maximize the opportunity.
Then I have a last question.
Yeah.
Okay. I just have one more.
Right.
Tell me about that. I saw the story in the Daily Line about the planning department vision for the future, and the quote there, so that 50 years from now we don't have to look back and say, how did we get so segregated? Put some meat on those bones for us.
Well, so the reality is that the city of Chicago has not had a land use plan since the 1960s, the late 1960s. So when Mayor Richard J. Daley was mayor. We've allowed planning and development to happen in fits and starts, really left to the vagaries of the developers to figure out what our future and literally what we look like as a city. We don't think that that makes sense. There's no, if you talk to any urban planner in the world, they say you got to have a plan. And whatever development happens needs to fit within a logical plan. So we are embarking upon this effort to make sure that we come up with, if you want to call it Burnham 2.0, that we have a plan for development in the city that builds upon our strengths, that looks beyond the downtown, that includes our neighborhoods so that no one gets left behind and we maximize the strengths of our city. So that's kind of the logic behind it, but we don't want to wait another, 70 years almost before we actually have a plan for Chicago that makes sense and is forward-looking as much as it addresses the needs now. Hey there, how are you?
I'm good. Long time no see. You spoke a little bit about the defund the police movement. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the cost drivers of the police department in this year's budget in terms of overtime, settlements, and what the city needs to do to come into compliance with the consent decree?
Well, almost 90% of the police budget is personnel. That's just a reality. And given the amount of efforts that's been made over the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of the diversity in the department really lies within the younger officers. So if we were literally talking about defunding the police and cutting police resources, what we would end up doing is cutting out officers and cutting out the diversity that has been achieved over the last 5 to 10 years. And truthfully, when I have engaged with folks, and I talk about this issue all the time, either at my initiation or others, and I asked, did you literally mean that you want to defund the police, that we don't want policing resources, for example, in your ward? Most people, 95+%, say, no, that's not what I mean. Now, there are truly some people who think, the police department is fundamentally broken, there's nothing that we can do regarding reform, and we need to just burn it to the ground and start all over again. I don't think that that's the majority of people's sentiments here in Chicago, and I know it's certainly not based upon national polling that I've seen, particularly recently. There have been some polling out about this issue. But what I'm hearing, and I think is 100% right, is we are speaking our values in the wrong ways. We are funding the police and not funding things in the community. We are not funding jobs, schools, mental health, affordable housing, and all of those things. And I agree with that 100%. That's why last year's budget, even in the face of what was then an historic number, we still spoke our values, because I do believe budgets are value statements. So we made historic investments in mental health, in affordable housing, in homelessness, in street outreach and intervention, and I expect us to continue to do that in this year's budget, even given the challenges that we face.
Could I also
Hi, it's Leah. I have a question to ask from someone else.
Okay.
Amy Jacobson from WIND Radio asks, an alderman tweeted about you being out of town. Amy wants to know if you think that's fair, considering the pandemic, looting.
You know what, I apologize, Leah, I don't think I understood the first part of the question.
Sorry.
That's okay.
So
When I hear Amy, I think of that Amy.
Amy.
My Amy.
No, this is, hello, Amy. No, this is Amy Jacobson.
Yes, I understand.
Her question. She's asking, an alderman tweeted, you were out of town. Amy asks, do you think that's fair, considering the pandemic, looting, and the fact that you've ordered Chicago police to work 12 hours on, 12 hours off, with no days off or vacations?
I'm here now, and I'm always in contact. So do I think that I needed a break? Of course, as everyone does. I've been encouraging my staff to take breaks. We all need to make sure that we're taking care of our physical and mental health. But as anybody who knows anything about being a mayor, you're always on duty. And I'm always on duty, 24/7, 7 days a week.
And a final question for me, I'm just looking at those who are on the stage who are helping you craft this budget for fiscal year 2021. You mentioned that you wanted to do it while adhering to the mission, I believe, or I believe I might be using the wrong word. But how do you think having diversity in your staff, diversity around the table when talking about these types of cuts, diversity of experiences, how does that help balance what needs to be done and the realities while being compassionate to those that have already been hurt so much in these past few months?
I think it makes all the difference in the world. The ladies that are here with me today are representative of the kind of diversity that we brought to the mayor's office. Most of my senior staff are women, and many of them are people of color. So, and they come with a variety of life experiences, and it helps us, I think, enormously. One of the other things that I believe is important is because my team and I come to the task of policymaking and government from lots of different perspectives, we make sure that we are bringing other voices into the discussion. You know, I meant what I said in my opening comments. This is probably going to be certainly one of the toughest budgets that we've ever had to address, but also one of the most important ones. We cannot abandon our values. We have to keep building on the things that we know are important to build healthy, safe, and vibrant communities, not only for next year, but really into the future. And having a diverse team and the public engagement that we intend to embark upon starting today is going to be incredibly important to making sure that we are speaking our values for all of Chicagoans. Tough choices are going to have to be made. We're not going to be able to please everyone, but I want to do everything that we can to listen and to look for opportunities to fulfill, I think, the mandate and the opportunity that we have to speak our values through this budget. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.